Welcome back. This lecture is going to focus on the forage consideration for horses. I'd like to first talk about the horse demographics in Kentucky. This is data from the 2012 Kentucky Equine Survey. And in that survey, they asked for a lot of information or found out a lot of information, but I want to highlight that we have horses basically across the whole state, with a concentration here in the central Kentucky area. We also have a total of 242,400 horses across 35,000 farms. To put that into perspective, we have about 1.1 million beef cows across about 45 to 50,000 farms. These farms, or the horses, are on about 1.1 million acres, and in 2011 created a $1.1 billion in revenue. The revenue in the equine horses is primarily from the thoroughbred sales, and this is highly dependent on the state of the economy. And so as the economy gets up or down, then that number goes up or down quite a bit. If you want to look at what kind of horses we have in Kentucky, we have many kinds, but the top three breeds are going to be thoroughbreds, quarter horses, and walking horses. The top uses are trail riding and pleasure horses. Brood mares is second, and then you can see them on around this pie chart. I want to compare ruminants to horses because we spent most of our time thinking about ruminants, thinking about the rumen, thinking about all of the things that means in terms of forages. Horses are hindgut fermenters. Their fiber digestion occurs in the cecum, the large colon, and the small colon at the rear of their tract. Their stomach is small, or at least I should say, and so it is in the ruminant, but the stomach is the first compartment with the horse. In the ruminant, the rumen is the first compartment, and it is large. So I want to talk about the GI tract comparisons for the horse and for cattle. In the horse, the fiber digestion occurs in the cecum and the colon. The energy is absorbed as volatile fatty acids, VFAs. Fiber digestion is in the hindgut, and the microbial nutrients are lost. In other words, the microbes that are digesting the fiber are growing and increasing in number or turning over, but these are at the rear of the digestion system, and they are excreted, and so we do lose some nutrients that would have been captured in the cecum microbes. And with a horse, it's better to have several small meals. If you compare that to the ruminant, the fiber digestion occurs in the rumen. The energy is absorbed as, again, volatile fatty acids. That's similar. The fiber digestion is in the foregut. The microbial nutrients are captured in this case. And it is okay to have 2 or 3 large meals for the ruminant. In fact, that's their preference. They will eat until they're full. Then they will go back and lie down and ruminate and chew their cud for that session. So to organize this lecture, I completely rethought this one and built it from the ground up because I wanted to cover some things specific to the thoroughbred industry. But as I got into it, there were many things that were unique in my mind about pasture and hay that needed special consideration. So that's what we're going to talk about for the remainder of the lesson. First of all, you may think of this picture as the quintessential horse farms, and surely they can't have any problems on these horse farms. But in fact, pasture problems are common to all horse farms. Now, pasture management goals for horses are going to be similar to those for cattle or for goats or sheep, in that we want persistence, we want maximum regrowth, we want utilization, and we want intake and quality. But horse pasture goals are going to be unique. Now, not unique in that they need nutrients or they supply nutrients, but they are unique in that they may be called on, or it may be the highest priority of that pasture to provide hoof support for exercise, or of course for both. If you list the ideal horse pasture characteristics, you're going to see some of the same things that Dr. Limcooler listed and others would list as the ideal horse pasture characteristics in general. Those would be probably good nutrition, long growing season, resilient, and stress tolerant. But in the horse pasture, the having a good ground cover is important. Having minimal anti-quality effects is going to be important, as it would be in cattle. But here's a couple of unique ones. Hoof support and aesthetics are going to be way up on the upper part of the priority list for horse pastures, and might not be as high if you were looking at cattle pastures. If you look at species for horse pasture, there are many options, but some are better than others. The best tolerate frequent close grazing, and of course that's bluegrass and Bermuda grass. Remember too that some have anti-quality factors such as red clover and the Slobbers syndrome, and especially the tall fescue and its end-of-fight effect, the toxic end-of-fight effects on mares. I would like to address particularly clover. So what about it for horse pastures? Well, clover is good for horse pastures for all the reasons it's good in cattle pastures. But there's something I'd like you to keep in mind when you're evaluating a horse pasture, and that is clover is good, but make sure you have a good grass stand first. White clover can be a very effective cover for the ground, but if you're evaluating that pasture on its ability to give you hoof support, especially when we get into wetter weather or the winter, white clover is going to be very poor at that. So clover might not have the high place in prioritization in horse pasture that it would be in cattle pasture. However, that's not to say, just to be clear, that we don't want that clover that we don't want the nutrition and nitrogen fixation that comes from clover. Those are very beneficial to pasture, very cost effective, very good for horses as well as cattle. Nitrogen usage may be different on horse pastures, and I'd call your attention to this publication, Soil Sampling and Nutrient Management in Horse Pastures. And one of the key points that it makes is it may be more important to apply nitrogen in the late fall to support more tillering in perennial grasses when it's too late to increase pasture yield. In other words, the reason for applying nitrogen in horse pastures may not be yield. In fact, that may be third on the list. But what may be first on the list is this fall application to stimulate tillering in those perennial cool season grasses. And of course, I want to take this opportunity to talk about how we handle the tall fescue end-of-fight issue. And that the primary way is to remove pregnant mares from toxic fescue for the last 60 days of gestation. Other things that you're going to want to do is have fields tested for the presence of end-of-fight. And of course, it goes without saying you need a clean pasture for pregnant mares to go to right before foaling. And I do want to remind you that veterinary treatments are available. That's the domperidone injections that are possible if you feel like a mare is extending her gestation or is not coming into milk. Then that injection is certainly a possible alternative. However, realize that it's expensive, and it's my understanding it's a daily shot. So it would not be your first priority. The first priority is have someplace non-toxic for pregnant mares to go. Now that does interact with our thoroughbred industry very specifically. Of course, our thoroughbred industry is built on the breeding operations and the foaling and broodmare operations. So broodmares are going to be rotated through pastures and barns based on the stage of gestation. So that means that the foaling barn is the foaling barn. And so that in the last month or so before foaling, that is where the mares are going to be, period. So this limits our options for rotational grazing and forage reseeding. We just don't have an infinite combination of fields to use on a farm. And you can't take that foaling barn field out of production. So the fields around the foaling barns especially have to be free of toxic tall fescue. One of the things we have not talked about, but there is a herbicide that will selectively take fescue out of bluegrass pastures. And that herbicide name is Plateau. So if we need to clean up that field around the foaling barn, we have options. So if you want to think about across all horse farms what the common problems are, these are the ones I would list. Weeds would be one. Lack of a good grass stand, which is pretty similar to weeds. Toxic tall fescue. But I will tell you the one that I think is the most common problem and the one that's hardest to solve is overstocking. That is, too many horses for not enough acres. This happens to be a picture from one of those operations. This is a boarding operation that built its business plan based on having 50 horses on 50 acres. If you do the web soil survey and the calculations for nutrition, you will find that it takes about 3 acres per mature horse in order to have enough pasture, 3 to 4, considering that the horses can very selectively graze. In this case, they took the bluegrass and the more favorable species down to the ground. You can see some clumps of fescue that they avoided, even though there was basically nothing to eat. And then the ragweed, which is a summer annual weed, just exploded. I want to remind you that grazing residual heights vary with bluegrass and Bermuda grass, the first and last one on this graph, being able to withstand the closest grazing and persist. Orchard grass and tall fescue intermediate. In fact, tall fescue can stand closer defoliation than orchard grass. And of course, as a review, of course, you remember that the endophyte toxicity is greater in the base of the plant than any other part of the plant. So grazing close with horses in toxic tall fescue will be a problem, especially for pregnant mares. Another common problem on horse farms is mud, and it calls for more often the development of high traffic area pads for horses than you would find on most beef cattle farms. And so I just wanted to call your attention to the fact that Dr. Higgins has put together some very good publications on how to construct these high traffic area pads. Now I'd like to change gears for the latter half of this lecture and talk about hay for horses. Dr. Laurie Lawrence has broken down the 5 characteristics of horse hay as the 5 C's: cleanliness, consistency, convenience, composition, and cost effectiveness. Let's take them in order. I'm talking about cleanliness refers to the breathable particles from hay that cause respiratory inflammation. These are going to be mold and pollen and small hay particles as well as dirt. Baling moisture is important in that baling at 15% moisture content, we have fewer mold spores and less dust compared to baling at 25% moisture content. And hay preservatives help. We have not talked about hay preservatives and whether or not that's good or bad for horses. What we have found is if you give the horses free choice between hay that has been treated with a preservative and the same hay that has not, they'll prefer the untreated hay. However, if they're not given a choice, they eat the same amount of hay that has been treated with preservatives for hay that has not. So hay preservatives do a good job if you use the right kind at the right rate, and they can help reduce the dustiness of hay. Something we have not talked very much about, and that is insect pests in forages other than the alfalfa weevil and the potato leafhopper of alfalfa. But one problem in horse hay in particular is the blister beetle. Blister beetles are an insect that feeds on flowers, and they are particularly active in weeds. And when they get trapped into hay and horses consume them, a compound in the blister beetle called cantharidin inflames the GI tract. And in fact, if they eat enough, then it can kill the horse. So we want to have hay that is free of blister beetles. It's really more than we've got time for in this class, but one of the ways to do that is to scout for them, to control weeds in alfalfa, to use the first or second cuttings because the blister beetle comes in the latter half of the season. And also, and this is one case where using a straight mower, not a mower conditioner, can help, because a mower conditioner will crush the blister beetles and they will be stuck in the hay. And of course, we want the hay to be free from foreign material such as twine and old netting and other sorts of things. One other area of cleanliness I want to call your attention to, or maybe remind you from earlier, is that there are some problem plants with physical characteristics, such as the millets that have bristles in their seed head. When these are mature, the bristles are rigid and they can penetrate and aggravate and cause problems in the lips and mouth of the horse. Consistency is important with equine hay, and it's one of the reasons why we import so much Western hay into Kentucky, like this load from Nebraska. I want to talk about consistency in colic because, let's first of all, let's talk about colic. It's an extreme abdominal pain that has a lot of causes, including temporary gas accumulation or impactions or obstructions that only can be relieved by surgery. Colic accounts for 15% of all deaths for horses over 6 months of age. And dietary change is one of the leading risk factors for equine colic. So these are some factors that lead to that should be avoided if we can to minimize the chance of colic, and that would be restricting or eliminating grazing, the amount of concentrate or grain consumed, and the type of hay fed. Hay quality and quantity should therefore be as consistent as possible. Okay, moving on to convenience. The small square bale is still the preferred package, even though it is more common to see round bales and larger rectangular packages on farms now. And it's the preferred package because most of the small farms are going to have to lift those bales by hand, and so the bale weight is going to be a significantly important factor for preference in terms of what kind of hay package that is preferred. That package influences how we feed hay. The ability of a rectangular bale to flake off into sizes or flakes that are roughly the right size for the horse you're about to feed is going to be important. It's easy to feed possibly outside on the ground, such as this farm is doing with their very high quality hay, and they spread this feeding out across the field, and there is very little waste. There is some waste, but the horses consume the large majority of the hay. Round bales can be fed, and as with cattle, having some sort of a feeding structure, hay feeding structure, is going to be preferred rather than feeding the round bale out alone by itself. When you're feeding round bales, it's best to be feeding them to larger groups of horses that can consume the hay in a shorter period of time. And it's also preferred to have hay structures like this hay hut that protect that round bale from rain from the top or moisture that comes in the form of rain so that it stays dry and they can take longer to eat it without deterioration of the bale. Let's move on to composition and talk a little bit about species first. It's common that alfalfa and alfalfa grass, I should say, are the most common types of hay that people prefer for horses. Some people prefer pure alfalfa, some people prefer alfalfa grass. Some farms will vary that depending on the nutritional needs of the horse, and that's the best plan possible. That grass with alfalfa could be or is probably going to be orchard grass or timothy on the farms in Kentucky. And of course, orchard grass and timothy make very good hays by themselves. If you go a little further south, you can find Bermuda grass, quite common, as a preferred hay for horses. And I'll mention teff, a summer annual warm season grass, as a possible hay for horses for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is a good species if you want to raise a emergency hay crop. And it also is one of the forages that has very, very low water soluble carbohydrates for insulin insensitive horses or those that have, which is the same thing as saying those that have equine metabolic syndrome. To talk about composition, you first have got to think about the equine needs. And this, like cattle, varies with the stage of growth or a stage of production. Mature gelding and light work, well, let's just take a look at 4 of these, and they will recur again on some of the later slides. We're going to look at mature geldings in light work, moderate or a mature gelding with moderate work, the lactating mare, and 10-month-old yearlings at 750 pounds. So let's take a look at, in particular, the caloric needs. Now, we haven't talked much about megacows of digestible energy per day, and this would be, it's got to be metric, or it could be pounds. I'm sorry, I don't remember what the units are for. Oh, it's megacows. Sorry, megacows per day. 22.6, 26.3. Look at the lactating mare. Boom. 36, basically 35.8. Then even the yearling is only 21.2. So the energy needs of that lactating mare are quite a bit higher than any other class. Look at the protein needs. The protein needs for the mature gelding, light work, or moderate work, and the yearling are similar. The lactating mare, almost double. So take a look at that increase in energy and protein needs of the lactating mare. Fast forwarding to the points we're going to make in a little bit, that's going to impact the best forage to meet these nutritional needs. So let's take a look at the composition of common forages. This is starting at the top on the left, spring pasture, then alfalfa hay mid-bloom, alfalfa hay early bloom, timothy hay late bloom, timothy hay early bloom, and Bermuda grass hay mid-maturity. Let's take a look at the digestible energy in megacows per pound. The spring pasture is the highest on that list in terms of energy content, comparable to early bloom alfalfa hay. Then you can see the effect of maturity coming into play, and of course, grasses are going to have a lower energy content than legumes, but not by as much as when you compare protein, which is a little further to the right. Percent NDF, of course, that's the total cell wall present in those forages, and you can see there's less cell wall in that fresh spring pasture and also in alfalfa compared to the grasses, which is just a normal characteristic of grasses compared to legumes. And it also points up just how high the quality is in spring pasture. In fact, spring pasture is higher in protein than even alfalfa hay cut at the right stage, and quite a bit higher than the timothy or Bermuda grass. So if you put these two together, here are the four. We did not put the Bermuda grass in here, but we've got pre-bloom alfalfa, full bloom alfalfa, mid-maturity alfalfa Timothy mix, and late maturity Timothy. Comparing and seeing how well they feed those four classes of horses, the mature horse in light work or moderate work compared to the lactating mare or the 10-month-old yearling, you can see that the lowest nutritional needs are going to be this mature horse in light work, and even mid-maturity alfalfa Timothy is way above its nutritional needs for protein and energy. Even late maturity is almost going to meet the nutritional needs of that horse. Dropping over to the next category, you can see that it's going to take pre-bloom alfalfa to meet the needs here. When you get to the lactating mare and the 10-month-old yearling, none of those forages are going to have the energy or protein in order to meet their needs. So composition is going to make a difference. You're going to want to feed that forage that is going to best match the nutritional needs of the horse with a minimum of concentrate feeding, because the horse's GI tract is built to have lots of small meals during the day and to eat a high fiber, high forage diet. And I want to spend just a moment talking about the equine metabolic syndrome, which is a collection of symptoms that places horses at high risk for laminitis, and that's infection of the hoof lamina. And insulin insensitivity is the key symptom. In other words, when the horse has sugar in the diet, or there's energy in the form of water-soluble carbohydrates go into the stomach and glucose is absorbed, the horse secretes insulin, but that insulin is not effective in lowering the blood glucose level. In order, and when we have diagnosed that horses have this equine metabolic syndrome, we need a diet low in non-structural carbohydrates. Low in energy and high in high fiber forage is ideal. And the examples that you might use are going to be fairly mature Timothy. I just say Timothy here, but fairly mature Timothy. And teff, that warm season annual grass that has as one of its very unique characteristics a very low water soluble carbohydrate content. And if you think about the nutrient composition in pastures, it of course had one of the highest energy contents of all of the forages that might be fed. So what this means is that horses with equine metabolic syndrome are particularly difficult to feed in that they cannot have free access to very, very lush green pasture without making their symptoms worse. So, when they have a flare or a really bad case of EMS and get laminitis, this is very crippling to the horse, and it may bring on the need to euthanize the horse. And the last point of Dr. Lawrence's list is cost effectiveness, and hay and straw is a major expense for any horse operation. So I'd like to summarize this horse lecture with these 4 points. Equine are fiber digesters, but they do so in the hindgut, unlike cattle. This has ramifications that we talked about. Pasture goals are going to be similar to cattle and other species, but they may, with horses, prioritize exercise and hoof support over the usual nutrition goals of other species. Stocking rate and overgrazing is the biggest problem on most farms, and while I'm here, pasture problems are common for every farm. And last, the key hay characteristics that we talked about are going to be cleanliness, composition, convenience, consistency, and cost effectiveness. So this brings us to the end of this very quick lecture on forage considerations for horses. We'll see you next time.